you ever heard of the Forbidden Forest in the neighboring village? A place abandoned, forgotten by time, holding secrets that should never be revealed. Those who dare enter it never return safely, or never return at all. Tonight, I will tell you a story about those who got lost in the darkness, about spirits still waiting among the trees. Are you brave enough to listen until the end? I remember the first time I heard about the forest from the elders in the village. They called it the Forbidden Forest, and none of us dared to approach it. There was something wrong with that place, something that made the air around it always feel colder, thicker, as if the sun never truly touched the ground there. But like most young people, my friends and I thought it was just a tale. Until one night, we decided to prove that all those stories were just superstitions. The 5 of us, me, Arya, Lita, Tony, and Nia, ventured into the forest armed with flashlights and curiosity. At first, everything seemed normal, just rows of tall trees and leaves rustling in the wind. But the deeper we went, the stranger it felt. The air grew heavier, like something was pressing from all sides. Nia, usually the bravest, started to show signs of unease. "We should go back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This doesn't feel right." I laughed, trying to calm myself. "Don't worry, it's just a forest. There's nothing here." But as I spoke, a shadow flickered between the trees, just at the edge of our vision. Arya aimed his flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing there. Only darkness, which seemed to swallow us more with each passing second. "Who was that?" Lita asked, her voice trembling. No one answered. We all stood frozen, listening intently. The wind, once soft, now turned into whispers. And then, we heard footsteps, slow but distinctly approaching. Someone, or something, was there with us. The footsteps grew louder, closer. We exchanged bewildered, terrified looks. It couldn't be anyone else, only we were foolish enough to enter the forest at night. My heart raced, pumping adrenaline through my veins. "We need to leave," Tony whispered, his voice hoarse and shaky. But before anyone could move, the footsteps stopped. No more footsteps, no more whispers. The forest became deathly silent, too silent. And in that silence, I heard the most terrifying sound I had ever heard in my life, a voice crying. It wasn't a normal cry. It was filled with despair, like someone who had been trapped in the darkness for centuries, losing all hope of ever returning to the light. Lita covered her ears, her face pale. "Who is that? What's happening?" I couldn't answer. My entire body felt frozen, like the tree roots beneath my feet had crawled into me, immobilizing me. Arya, the bravest among us, started walking toward the sound. "We have to check. Maybe someone needs help." "Don't, Arya." Nia grabbed his arm, but Arya shook her off and continued into the darkness. We had no choice but to follow, even though each step felt wrong, like walking toward an invisible abyss. The crying grew louder as we approached the source, until finally, we saw her, a woman, standing among the trees. Her hair was tangled, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow, and her clothes torn, as if she had been trapped here for a long time. Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The woman didn't answer. She just stared at us, her crying continuing. But as Arya stepped closer, she vanished, disappearing into the darkness. We all stood still, unable to believe what we had just witnessed. Something beyond explanation had happened, and we all knew that this was only the beginning of the nightmare that awaited us. After the woman disappeared, we stood in silence, looking at each other in confusion and fear. What had we just seen? Was it real, or just an illusion conjured by this forest? The atmosphere grew even more ominous, as if the forest itself was watching our every move. "We have to leave now," Nia whispered. Her hand trembled as she gripped my arm. "This isn't right. This isn't a place we should be." Tony nodded in agreement. "We've come too far. No one knows we are here. If something happens..." "Nothing will happen if we stay calm," Arya interrupted. He was still trying to maintain control, though his face no longer showed the confidence it had earlier. "There's probably a logical explanation for all of this." I wanted to believe his words, but deep down, I knew that nothing about this place was logical. We decided to turn around and try to retrace our steps back to the path. But somehow, the forest had changed. Everything looked the same: towering trees, branches swaying gently in the wind that now felt cold and biting. As we walked, I noticed something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Our footprints. There were no footprints. Even though all 5 of us had been walking on the damp, wet ground, there were no signs that we had ever been there. It was as if the forest refused to acknowledge our presence. "Do you see this?" I whispered quietly, afraid of what the answer might be. Lita looked down at the ground, her face pale. "What does this mean? Why aren't our footprints there?" "Because we were never really here," Tony said, his voice hoarse. "Or maybe we're stuck somewhere we shouldn't have touched." Those words echoed in my mind, adding to the tension that already hung heavy in the air. Our steps quickened, and with every passing second, it felt like a race against time. But no matter how far we walked, the forest seemed endless. There was no way out, no sign that we were getting closer to the village. And then, we heard the sound of footsteps again. This time, faster, louder, not just one person. The sound came from all directions, as if we were surrounded by something unseen, moving at an unimaginable speed. "We have to run," Lita screamed, and without thinking, we all bolted. I could feel the air growing colder around me, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how fast we ran, the sound of those footsteps always followed, getting closer, as if ready to catch us at any moment. Exhausted and out of breath, we finally stopped in a small clearing between the trees that seemed slightly more open. The place looked brighter compared to the rest of the forest, even though the sun was nowhere to be seen in the sky. We all stood silently, trying to catch our breath and listen. There were no more footsteps. Yet the tension remained, as if something or someone was watching from the shadows. "Is this the place?" Tony suddenly asked. His voice sounded tense, but there was confusion in it. I turned my head, looking around. This place looked different from the rest of the forest. The ground was flat, and in the center, there was something that resembled a mound. "What place?" I asked, though I, too, felt something strange here. Arya approached the mound, his face showing suspicion. this isn't just a random mound. It looks like. Before Arya could finish his sentence, the ground beneath the mound suddenly moved. We all stepped back in fear. Slowly, from within the earth, a hand emerged. The hand was pale white, with long, decayed nails. Then, another hand appeared, and something resembling a human body began to crawl out of the ground. Lita screamed, backing away while covering her mouth with both hands. No, this can't be happening. We have to get out of here. I couldn't think clearly. My gaze was fixed on the figure slowly lifting its body from its hidden grave. The figure wasn't whole, only the upper half, crawling toward us with its thin hands. But the most horrifying thing was its face. The same face as the woman we had seen earlier, crying in the forest. She's that woman, Nia whispered. The figure kept approaching, its hands reaching toward us as if asking for help. But in its empty eyes, I could sense an overwhelming fury. It wasn't seeking help. It was seeking revenge. Let me know if you need any more translations or adjustments. As the figure drew closer, the tension in the air thickened. Her pale face and empty eyes made us all shudder in fear. No one dared to move, as if we were all frozen, captivated by the horrifying sight. The figure kept crawling, her thin, filthy hands dragging her body across the ground. The sound of her hands scraping the dirt sent chills down my spine. We need to leave now, Arya shouted, snapping us out of our shock. He started running in the opposite direction, and without thinking, we all followed. Our steps grew faster, our feet sinking into the wet ground that seemed to get stickier, as if the earth was trying to hold us back. Behind us, I could still hear the groaning of the figure, growing fainter but still terrifying. But as we ran further, the forest once again became an endless labyrinth. There was no clear path out, only darkness in every direction. As we stopped to catch our breath, Nia began to cry. I can't do this anymore. I can't take it. We're never going to get out of here, are we? Her voice broke, reflecting the feelings we all shared. No, we are getting out of here, Arya replied, though his tone lacked conviction. He tried to maintain control, but fear was beginning to take hold of him too. Suddenly, a scream shattered the silence. It sounded so close, almost right beside us. Doni, who was standing a short distance away, suddenly collapsed and screamed. His face turned pale, and his hands were frantically trying to pull something invisible from his neck. What is it? Doni yelled, his voice trembling with fear. Help! Help me! We all rushed toward him, but there was nothing there. Only Doni, struggling against something we couldn't see. His hands gripped his neck, as if some invisible force was choking and dragging him to the ground. Hold him, Arya shouted, trying to help Doni. Arya and I grabbed Doni, desperately trying to free him from the invisible grip. Meanwhile, Nia and Lita stood frozen, helpless. When we finally managed to pull Doni away, he gasped for air, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. There's something attacking me, he whispered weakly. Something in this forest doesn't want us to leave. We knew then that something far more powerful than just spirits was in this place. There was a darker force at play, something watching our every move, toiling with our fears. After helping Tony to his feet, we realized we couldn't keep running aimlessly. If we did, we would only get more lost and trapped. This forest held secrets, and we had to find them if we wanted to survive. I remember my grandfather once told me about an old tree in the middle of this forest, Arya suddenly said. Legend has it that the tree is the center of all the curses in this place. If we can find it, maybe we can stop all of this. Though it sounded impossible, we had no other choice. Clinging to a faint hope, we decided to search for the tree. Maybe it would give us clues about what was really happening in this forest. The journey to find the tree became more difficult. The once silent forest was now filled with strange sounds, whispers we couldn't understand, shadows darting quickly at the edges of our vision, and an eerie sensation that something or someone was constantly watching us from behind the trees. After hours of walking, we finally found it. The tree was larger than I had imagined, towering high with its roots entwined intricately in the ground. Its bark was rough and covered in strange symbols, seemingly etched into it centuries ago. In the faint moonlight, the tree appeared alive, as if it was breathing an aura full of darkness. Do we really have to do this? Lita asked, her voice trembling. What if this makes things worse? There's no other way, Arya replied firmly. We've come too far. We have to find out what's happening here. As we approached the tree, a sudden gust of wind blew, and the whispers turned into screams. The ground around the tree began to shift, as if something was buried beneath it. I could feel a strong energy around us, an energy filled with pain, anger, and suffering. This is the place, Tony whispered. This is where it all began. Let me know if you need more translations or further assistance. The sound of wind roared around us, and the air suddenly turned cold, piercing our skin. The ancient tree in front of us appeared even more ominous, as if it was emitting an indescribable power. Its roots moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, but I was certain something alive was lurking beneath them. The tree was the center of all the terror we had experienced, and now we stood before it, not knowing what to do next. Tony, who had seemed strong all this time, started trembling. This is wrong. Everything is wrong. We shouldn't be here. Arya tried to calm us, though his voice sounded full of doubt. We need to find out what's going on. We can't turn back now. How? Nia asked in a hoarse voice. What do we do? What's really here? Suddenly, without warning, the ground around the tree began to tremble. We all stepped back in fear as cracks appeared in the earth, separating the large roots. From within those cracks, a rancid stench wafted up like the smell of decaying flesh. Then, a faint sound emerged, like a scream from deep within the ground, a scream that seemed to come from spirits long trapped. What is that? Lita choked out. Don't go near it. Arya warned us, but it was too late. From the gaping cracks, a dark shadow emerged, quickly taking the shape of a human. However, it had no clear form, just a shadow with no details, and glowing red eyes in the midst of the darkness. The figure stood still for a moment, then began to move toward us. Its steps were slow, but menacing. With every step it took, the air around us grew colder, nearly freezing. We couldn't move, only stare in terror as the figure drew closer. Who are you? Arya tried to speak, though I could hear the fear in his voice. The shadow stopped, its blazing red eyes staring directly at us. "You have come to the wrong place. You have disturbed our peace." Its voice was deep and filled with hatred, echoing among the trees. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and my body grew even colder. We didn't mean to disturb," Arya replied, his voice trembling. "We just want to know what happened here." The shadow chuckled softly, its laugh sounding like the cries of 1,000 tortured souls. "You will never understand. This place doesn't belong to you. You have entered a world not meant for humans." We were all silent. The shadow stepped closer, and as it stood before us, it raised its black, terrifying hand, pointing at the old tree behind it. "This is where it all began," it said with a sharp voice. "The sins of mankind, the blood spilled, a curse that will never end." I couldn't hold back any longer. "What do you mean? What really happened here?" The shadow turned, looking at the tree with a gaze full of malice. "You want to know? Very well. I will show you the truth. But be warned, once you see it, there is no turning back." Suddenly, the atmosphere around us changed. The dark and eerie forest began to tremble, and the cold wind blowing through the trees grew stronger. The ground beneath our feet shifted, and before we could react, the world around us transformed. We were now in the middle of a scene that seemed to be from the past. The old tree still stood tall, but its surroundings looked different. Around the tree, people dressed in traditional clothing were gathered in a circle that looked like a ritual. Their faces were tense, filled with fear and anguish. "You are witnessing their greatest sin," the shadow's voice echoed again, though we no longer saw its form. "This is the beginning of the curse that brought doom to this place." In the center of the circle, a young girl with a pale face knelt on the ground. Her hands were tied behind her back, and her eyes were filled with tears. In front of her stood an old man, holding a long knife that glistened under the moonlight. "We must do this," the old man said in a heavy voice. "It's the only way to save the village. The spirits of the forest must be given a sacrifice." The girl sobbed, but no one moved to help her. The people around her just stood still, as if they were paralyzed by fear. "Please, I don't want to die," the girl whimpered, her voice barely audible. But the old man didn't listen. With a swift motion, he raised the knife high, and in an instant, plunged it into the girl's heart. We were all silent, too shocked to say anything. The girl's blood flowed into the ground, seeping into the roots of the old tree, and at that moment, the air around us changed. The pungent smell of rot filled the air, and the old tree began to tremble, as if it was responding to the blood sacrifice. That was when the curse began, the shadow's voice whispered. A blood offering that was never enough. The girl's spirit became part of this forest, and as long as the curse remains, no one will ever leave alive. We watched in horror as the girl's body was absorbed by the ground beneath the tree, becoming one with its roots. And in an instant, we were back in the present, standing before the old tree, which now felt more terrifying than ever before. Let me know if you need further translations or help. The air around us felt heavier, as if filled with endless sorrow and anger. After witnessing the brutal murder that took place centuries ago, we all fell silent. The old tree stood proudly, its roots creeping underground felt alive, as if they were absorbing the pain and suffering of every soul trapped in this place. "What do we do now?" Lita asked, her voice trembling. Her eyes were fixed on the old tree, clearly engulfed by fear. "This curse, will we also become part of it?" "I don't know," Arya replied. "But one thing is certain, we have to find a way to stop all of this. If not, we will be trapped here forever." "I think this isn't just about stopping the curse," Tony said quietly. "We must free the souls trapped here. That girl, she's just one of many victims. This forest is filled with souls that cannot rest in peace." Hearing Tony's words, I felt a chilling silence. The souls trapped here were not just victims, they were witnesses to a greater curse. Every step we took brought us closer to a truth that could destroy us. Suddenly, the rumbling sound from within the ground was heard again. The roots around the tree began to move, crawling on the surface like snakes searching for prey. A faint sound of screams echoed in the distance, like the cries of people drowning in eternal suffering. "Watch out!" Arya shouted. "Back up!" We all ran away from the old tree, but the ground beneath us began to tremble violently. A large crack appeared in front of us, and before we could react, it opened wide, pulling us down into it. I fell into darkness, thrown deep into the ground. When I regained consciousness, my head ached, and my whole body trembled. Around me, the atmosphere was very dark and damp, filled with the stinging smell of wet earth. We had all fallen into a cave beneath the forest, a place filled with mystery and fear. "Where are we?" Nia asked in a hoarse voice. "I don't know," Arya replied as he stood up. "But I think we are very close to the heart of this curse." I looked around, trying to understand our situation. The cave was large, with stone walls covered in large roots. In the center of the cave, something caught my attention, a stone altar covered with carvings of ancient symbols similar to those we saw on the old tree earlier. "Look at that," Tony said, pointing at the altar. "Is this where it all began?" Arya cautiously approached the altar. He observed the carvings on the stone carefully, trying to find clues. "This isn't just an altar. This is a place of worship. This is where they made sacrifices, and maybe this is where all those souls are trapped." "Then, how do we stop all of this?" I asked. "What do we need to do?" Before Arya could answer, footsteps echoed. From the darkness of the cave, a very familiar figure emerged, the shadow we had seen before, with glowing red eyes. This time, the shadow appeared not just as a vague figure, but transformed into something more real. Its large black body exuded an aura that made the air around us feel even colder. "You shouldn't be here," its voice echoed throughout the cave. "This is the place of the curse, and you will become part of that curse." The shadow moved closer quickly, and before we could react, it attacked. A strong wind blew from its body, hitting us with an unseen force. We were thrown back, our bodies slamming hard against the cave wall. I coughed, trying to rise even though my body felt so weak. The shadow approached closer, and I knew we didn't have much time. "We have to destroy that altar," Arya shouted. "It might be the only way to stop this curse." With the remaining strength we had, we tried to reach the altar. The tree roots around the cave began to move, trying to block our path. We ran as fast as we could, dodging the outstretched roots, trying to reach the altar before it was too late. As we finally reached the altar, the shadow drew nearer. Its screams filled the cave, making our ears ring. Arya lifted a large stone lying on the ground, and with all his strength, he struck the altar with it. Small cracks began to appear on the surface of the altar, and a rumbling sound echoed from deep within the ground. The shadow lunged toward us, but before it could reach us, the altar shattered into pieces. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the cave changed. The air, once filled with fear and anger, began to gradually calm. The shadow let out a long, heart-wrenching scream before finally disappearing into the darkness, absorbed by the ground beneath the cave. We fell silent, too exhausted to speak. The forest that had felt filled with a curse now slowly began to feel more peaceful. The sounds of the screams that had disturbed our thoughts faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. Is it all over? Lita asked in a faint voice. Arya nodded slowly. I think so. The souls, they can finally rest in peace. We exchanged glances in silence, realizing that although the curse had ended, the horrific experience we endured in this forest would forever be etched in our memories. The curse in this forest has ended, but our story will never be the same again. What we experienced will continue to haunt our minds, and the shadows of the past will never truly disappear. What would you do if you were in a situation like this? Would you run away or face the darkness? Remember, fear cannot be avoided, but courage is when you choose to fight against the darkness even as fear freezes your heart. Dare to continue seeking the truth, even if it means facing the souls trapped in an eternal curse. Don't let fear stop you. Share this story, and who knows, there might be more mysteries waiting to be discovered in the most unexpected places.